Homeschooling is a very interesting and exciting way to give a child an education. And even if your children are grown or you don't have any children at all, you too can be involved. Homeschooling, of course, has been around since the beginning of the human race, but in modern times we've moved more towards public education. In the 60s and the 70s, people became a little disillusioned with the public education system, some of them with the quality of education, some of them became disappointed with the political viewpoints and perhaps religious viewpoints that people were learning in the public schools. So they started occasionally homeschooling around the country. By the 1990s, it had blossomed into a movement, and now homeschooling happens to be a very common choice for people to educate their children. There are a lot of ways you can homeschool. Some people choose the traditional textbook method. They buy textbooks similar to what they have in the public school, and then either they teach the class or they even buy DVDs that have professional instructors teaching the class, and they can just have their children sitting at the kitchen table, but they're in a traditional classroom atmosphere. I was not so organized, so I chose what's called the workbook method. This is a method where you purchase curriculum that comes in workbooks. I had 10 workbooks for each subject for an entire year. The workbooks had the text that the children needed to learn, it had tests, and it had instructions on how to do all of the projects required during the year, whether it's a science project or a research paper or whatnot. So by the time you're done with all of your subjects, each child has done their 10 workbooks for the year. I'm going to mention another one that I never got to do, but I always thought it would be very fun. It's called a unit study method. And a unit study is where you take a subject. It might be a time period. Let's say you chose the colonial period, or you might choose the medieval period of time. You might choose a career. How about a firefighter or architecture? You would take whatever subject you choose, and then you would incorporate something from history, from science, from math, language arts. You would incorporate all those aspects into that one subject. I'll give you an example. Let's take bees, for instance. You could learn about the history of bees, beekeeping, and honey throughout history. You can figure out what the specific needs and advancements were throughout history. You could learn about how it's used in cooking by actually cooking with it. You can find out the difference between taste and texture by using honey. You can learn about science, learn about pollen. You have biology with that. You may learn about bees, how they make their honey. You might even plan to have a field trip to visit a beekeeper and find out really how it works. All along the way, you might write a research paper. You could perhaps write a narrative about your trip to the beekeeper. All these things would then be applied to your language arts portion. A unit study might take a day. You might take a week to accomplish it. I know people who studied the medieval time period, and they took an entire year to do it, and at the end of the year they would have a medieval feast with no silverware. And the kids had a great time. They would all make their costumes and had a ball. So it's really a hands-on way to learn. Again, it takes a lot of organization to do that, but, and I never got to participate, but it sounded like a lot of fun. But I said you guys could be involved as well. Each one of us have an area of expertise. We all have hobbies. Maybe you know about math and science. Maybe you know about how to build a house. As my children were growing, I was fortunate enough to live next door to my parents. My mother and my father had each week about 10 or 15 children either in their house or in my basement, and they ran what's called a satellite school. These homeschooled kids would come. My dad would teach physics, chemistry, algebra, calculus, public speaking. He also taught career management. And my mom would take the little kids. She'd take them on hikes, and they'd pick up little bits of nature and label them and paste them in paper. She'd have them read poetry or maybe write a little poetry. She'd read books to them and help them with their reading. And both of my parents would make their students memorize Bible verses. The younger kids would memorize a verse or two, and the older kids might even memorize an entire chapter. as these children grew and went through their satellite school, they were able to get a little bit more of a well-rounded education. And any one of you could participate in something like that as well. Maybe you know about science. Maybe you're not squeamish like I was and can dissect a frog. Some squeamish mother would be very grateful for you to help that out. We have a member of our group here, Cindy, who worked with some homeschoolers on leadership and communication. And I've been told by some of the members of that group that she not only did it enthusiastically, but the kids learned a lot. And it was obvious that she was very interested in teaching them. I have a friend whose children were in my dad's satellite school for several years, and I remember she told me that she was very glad that my dad's classes were all biblically based because her son tended to quote Mr. Neeson more than he quoted the Bible. And that told me that my dad had a huge influence on this kid's life. And you can have an influence on the children around you by participating in a satellite school. Maybe you have something that you could contribute and you find a group that you can teach. It's a very satisfying thing to be involved in a child's education, and as they grow up and they're successful and they're well-rounded, you know you've had a part in it. I hope that each of you will someday be able to be a part of the exciting world of homeschooling.